I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now is Dr. Noel Ritson-Bennett. He's a veterinary program manager for Western Canada with CFIA. Welcome here, Dr. Ritson-Bennett.
Thank you. Nice to be
Well,
here.
I wish it was under better circumstances, certainly, in that serious news out of Manitoba, hearing a dairy herd in Manitoba testing positive for bovine TB. We did report on the initial finding, but definitely want to dig into some of the common questions that we're getting, and that I have as well. First, let's start with the very basics. What is bovine tuberculosis? Because I think sometimes you hear the word TB and it conjures up all sorts of things. How is bovine TB different, the same as what we might see in humans?
Bovine TB is a bacterial disease that is transmitted predominantly within bovine animals, so cattle. There are some subtle differences between what we typically think of as human tuberculosis, so that it's a different organism, but it's very similar. Both organisms can affect humans though as well. So we talk of bovine TB as being a zoonotic disease, meaning that it's transmissible from animals to humans. And indeed, much of the control programs that we've put in place for just over 100 years in Canada now are based upon the fact that tuberculosis is a zoonotic disease, and so there's consequences if it is allowed to be transmitted or within the herd within Canada or from animals to humans.
So they are separate but similar organisms, and bovine TB can be contracted by humans. It is zoonotic.
That's right. So they're both part of what was referred to as Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex, which is again a group of organisms that behave similarly and are somewhat difficult to differentiate unless you do specific testing. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex comprises more than bovine tuberculosis or tuberculosis bovis and human tuberculosis. There's also numerous other organisms within that group. But so they're separate species in terms of bacteria, but they're very similar, very closely related.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the herd in Manitoba. It's a dairy herd where there was a positive animal. In my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've heard about this certainly in maybe the beef side. Is it very rare to find it in dairy? How common is it to find it in dairy cattle?
So in Canada, we haven't recently, you're right, we haven't seen it in a dairy herd for some time. I believe it's some time ago, and you're right in that predominantly we have seen sporadic cases of TB, mostly in Western Canada and again in beef herds. And so it is a little bit unusual for us or novel, I would say, not necessarily unusual, novel for us in Canada to find the disease in a dairy herd. That being said, in other parts of the world, it's a very common place to find tuberculosis in dairy herds, including our neighbors to the south. They have certainly seen TB in dairy herds recently.
Where then does a TB infection typically come from? Are there wild animals that can carry it? Is it one of those we wish we knew? Or where? How does it end up in either a beef herd or a dairy herd, for that matter?
So that's really a big question. Okay, recently, so in recent memory, up until in Manitoba around Riding Mountain, some people will remember that there was tuberculosis around Riding Mountain, and there was tuberculosis amongst the elk and deer around Riding Mountain National Park, and so in that instance, there was transmission between wildlife and cattle. That there was interaction and there was a lot of work that went into separating the interactions. So even putting fences up around feed, for example, and when we were able to do that, we eliminated the potential for contamination of feed, and we were able to eliminate tuberculosis from the cattle. All of the tuberculosis cases that we've seen since that time and recently do not have any linkages to wildlife. In terms of the organism that we've seen in wildlife, and the similarities are not the same organisms that we're seeing today or within in the last sort of 10, 15 years. All that to say is that yes, wildlife can be a reservoir for tuberculosis, but it's not something that we're seeing presently, and certainly not in this case. The latest data that we have is that, similar to recent cases, is that this is a new introduction to Canada. And it is most closely related to other tuberculosis cases that have been identified in the United States or Mexico.
When something like this is found, so a positive case like this in a dairy herd, is there testing to basically like fingerprint it, like to look at the actual makeup of
Yes,
the,
so
okay,
it's
yeah,
called spelegotyping. Yeah, and they're able to go back and look at
okay,
the genetic makeup of the bacteria, and then again they can compare that with
okay,
other bacteria that we have on record. And so we share that. We have a database that the vast majority of recent cases in Canada, and we also share that information with the U.S. and vice versa. And so
okay,
that's how we can closely say that, well, this is the closest relative that we have known relative comes
okay.
from other cases that we've identified. And that's, so all that to say is that there is no linkage at all
Okay.
to wildlife in these cases.
In thinking about, and we'll unpack sort of what it means for beef herds, dairy herds in a moment, but from the human side, how is tuberculosis spread? Do we need to worry about a dairy cow and milk, etc., or does pasteurization take care of that? How might a human contract bovine TB?
So you're right. So milk is a potential source of contamination, but pasteurization, and we pasteurize all of our commercial milk in Canada. Pasteurization will kill the organism, and so milk and milk products are safe to eat. Likewise, all of our meat, it goes through inspection. And so that is how this case was identified. Again, an animal went to a federal slaughter plant. An inspector noticed lesions that were compatible with tuberculosis. Samples were taken and it was submitted to the lab, and that animal was withheld. It was condemned, so it wasn't in the food chain. So we have processes in place to mitigate that risk of transmission to humans, and mainly inspection and pasteurization. That being said, the prevalence of the disease within animals in Canada is very low. It is zoonotic, and so those are why those things are in place, and that's why pasteurization plays a huge part in our public health, to be honest, because it eliminates those diseases such as tuberculosis.
Now, and that I think brings up an interesting point about this and a question that I had. You know, I have livestock. There are certain things you look for that an animal is unwell or not doing well that may indicate certain issues, and some of them may be metabolic, some of them may be pathogenic. How would a producer suspect, or why would they suspect TB? How do animals present if they're infected with TB?
Tuberculosis is typically thought of as a chronic disease. I mean, it's not something that has, that you can look at an animal and say right away, I know what's going on here. Oftentimes, animals that maybe appear normal at a distance, or even clinically, when we see them in slaughter, and through inspection, we can identify those lesions. And so it's not something that it's typically diagnosed per se routinely as a matter of just normal course. Some of the ways that it can be identified and it is through testing. So prior to the early 80s, there was a mandatory sort of test, the removal of reactor animals, and that was a routine thing. And so from 1923 up until the early 80s, there was 50 million cattle tested, or 50 million tests performed in Canada.
Wow.
400,000 animals were removed from the national herd because they were reactors. There was an estimate that in 1923, 1 in 20 herds was infected with bovine tuberculosis.
Wow.
And so over that period of time, with, again, a huge investment of effort and resources through, from the industry itself and obviously what would have been Agriculture Canada, I guess, at the time, we've gotten to a place where the prevalence of disease, we've identified those animals. And so it's been a tremendous amount of effort to get to where we are now, that we enjoy a low prevalence of disease, and that we also are able to enjoy that status that we can say we are so-called free from the disease, and we can
Right.
tell our trading partners that we are, and as such, we enjoy that favorable status because of our prevalence of tuberculosis.
And so that is another of my questions because I love social media for a lot of things, and one of them is that I get to watch how agriculture happens in other countries, and there are other countries. I'm thinking about the UK and some of our friends over there that, as far as I understand it, TB testing is much more prevalent. They have a much larger issue there with it, and so that still is ongoing. That there is a lot of TB testing.
It is certainly concerning that we've seen cases in fairly quick succession, which is it's a little bit more frequent than we've come to expect. But we do expect that we will see sporadic cases periodically,
Right.
and the point being is that when we do see those cases, that we respond appropriately, meaning that we will depopulate the herd, that we will do appropriate tracing and identify animals that were potentially could have introduced
Right.
that and where did that potentially go? We also do surveillance testing, in proximity to the herd, and there's also wildlife surveillance as well to
Okay.
say, is this potentially in wildlife? By having a robust response that is thorough, and we look and try to find and try to identify potential sources of infection, we're able to stand up and say, you know what, yes, we do see sporadic cases, but it's under control and we respond appropriately, and as such we still are going to maintain our status for tuberculosis.
In thinking about, dairy animals can cross borders, commingle, and all those sorts of things. So traceability is obviously a huge part of this. How long might a trace out like that take? Even just in average circumstances, because I don't know about this particular herd if they had brought in a lot of animals or not. I don't know anything about them, but how long does a trace out like that take?
Again, it totally depends on the complexity of the case, and on the operation of the case. So like you said, depending on whether or not that farm keeps great records, or
Mm.
the producer keeps really good records, and what their management practices are. If they're buying a lot of in the case of a beef herd, if their management practice is to buy heifers and then breed them, for example, and sell them in the fall as bred heifers. I mean, that just introduces a level of
Yeah.
complexity. And again, if those animals are moving on to breeding herds, additional breeding herds, then again, the web just gets a little bit bigger. Versus if those animals are going to a feedlot, we don't tend to be as concerned because those are typically terminal. Those animals undergo inspection when they go through an
Right.
abattoir, and so those are easy to check off. We do have the other part of it is that dairy trace is as we're coming to realize now is a very robust system, and so it's
Mhm.
if the producer is diligent about making sure that all those movements are recorded within dairy trace, it's much simpler for us to be able to push a
Right.
button and we can see very quickly where animals have come and gone. In instances that in a beef herd where there is that similar dairy trace system doesn't exist, then while we might have CCIA tags, there's not necessarily mandatory reporting of those
That's
movements, and
right.
so we're required to use sales records, brand inspection records, et cetera, like that, to try and piece that together. And so that can literally take months and
Yeah.
months, depending on, and again, it just depends on the complexity of the operation, and the management practices of the operation will really dictate how long it takes to do that tracing. No doubt, again, because we are looking to try and eliminate the disease, if you are a producer who has received animals from that infected premise, then your herd will be subject to testing. But provided in the vast majority of cases we don't find tuberculosis in
Right.
another herd, and so it is a minor inconvenience for a period of time while we're on site and we're performing those testing, and in some instances we have to do additional tests,
Right.
but we're very cognizant of the inconvenience that it is to producers, and we try to work with them to make it work in terms of timing, and try to limit the amount of time and disruption that is necessary.
Knowing and as you stated, the finding around Riding Mountain By the way, not a mountain. Manitoba plays very fast and loose with names of things. I mean, the wildlife plays a role here potentially in being a reservoir, as you said, not just of tuberculosis, but other diseases. Is there, like, does CFIA work with, or is there a department, or what happens with wildlife as far as, is there surveillance within the wildlife population for things like bovine TB?
There is, and typically, wildlife is the domain of the provinces. So they do have surveillance programs. Like I said, most recently in Saskatchewan, for example, there's the cases. There was a case in 23, and there's been wildlife surveillance in the region around where we identified it. There will be surveillance for the case in 24, which is sort of in the process of being talked about and planned. And then likewise in Manitoba, we will conduct surveillance. The province, again, we'll work with the province, with our partners, to support surveillance of wildlife. But I want to be very clear, this case and most recent cases do not have any linkages
None.
to wildlife that we've identified to date.
Okay.
And so it's important that we look and just to make sure they're not contributing to that, but we have no evidence to believe that they are. That when I say they, I mean wildlife, typically it's other elk and deer, cervids.
Right.
You talked about the UK. They have a problem with badgers, which is, again,
sort of bizarre.
A different sort of situation, but that does tend to be a real problem. I know I was in New Zealand. They had things like possums and cats, but it's not something that we've seen as a problem here. Like I said, Riding Mountain was a specific case, a specific situation. I think this speculation or the belief is that wildlife got the disease from cattle, and then it sort of became present within the wildlife, and then there was a spillover back into cattle.
I want to ask about treatments or vaccines. So obviously prevention and trace outs and all these things are great, but seeing as it's not sort of an acute, like you can't look at an animal and know their TB status. I know it's very rare. Is this something that could be vaccinated for and prevented, or is it something that if an animal is positive could be treated?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
So in humans, for example, humans get tuberculosis and they undergo treatment for a long duration, multiple antibiotics or antimicrobials. So theoretically, could you treat an animal for tuberculosis? Potentially, but it would require huge doses of antibiotics for an extended period of time, and then to what end, right? Yeah. And so you risk the idea of, the accepted practice amongst the world in the animal space is that we manage tuberculosis via the population because it is so hard to manage and to deal, and it just doesn't make economic sense to think about treating animals. I have heard of elephants, for example, in a zoo setting, and again, controlled setting. Interestingly enough, elephants are susceptible to tuberculosis. I think it's often the human tuberculosis, and again, they would probably get it from humans.
Probably.
And so treating an individual animal in an instance like that because of the nature of the animal, etc. And likewise, there is no effective vaccine that I'm familiar or aware of for tuberculosis.
That is actually my last question. All right, Noel, thank you so much for joining me. This has been incredibly enlightening. I probably could come up with more questions and even more difficult questions, but I will let you go at that one. Thank you very much, though, because the audience has been, I've got several emails and DMs. No one's panicking per se, but I think that we recognize the seriousness of this disease and want to make sure that we've got, clear information on what it means and what it doesn't mean. So I do thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you.